Hello, this is Dr. Nelson. This week we are going to be continuing our discussion of plant evolution and diversity, and we're going to be focusing this week on the seed plants. So the seed plants are going to include both the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, which are the plants that you're probably most familiar with because those are the plants that currently dominate the world. I'm not going to go through all these learning objectives today, but you're going to want to make sure that you understand all these concepts. They're very much similar to the ones we covered last week, but they apply to the seed-bearing plants. One thing you want to focus on is the plant-pollinator relationship, so that's going to be something new compared to last time, and also the differences in the alternation of generations life cycle that we see with seed plants. Okay, so last week we talked about all the basal plants, right? So we talked about our bryophytes, our seedless vascular plants. We're going to be focusing up here on the top of the evolutionary tree. So we're going to be discussing the gymnosperms and the flowering plants. And if we look here, we'll see that the derived trait that's shared in this clade is the production of seeds. Okay. The other trait that we're going to be studying is found only in the flowering plants, and that's fruit. So the flowering plants produce flowers, which then develop into fruits, and that is a derived trait shared among angiosperms. All these other traits that we talked about last week, so things like protected embryo and vascular tissue, those will be ancestral traits in the groups that we discussed today. So what are seeds and what makes them so important? So the seeds for vascular plants, seed plants are vascular plants that use seeds for an agent of dispersal. Okay, so dispersal is getting away from the parent, right? So the organism needs to get away from the parent plant to reduce competition for resources. The seed plants have produced seeds that help facilitate this process on dry land. So seed plants are the most abundant plants on Earth. There are over 300,000 species of seed plants. Most of those are going to be the flowering plants, the angiosperms, but there are still quite a number of gymnosperms as well. The seed plants first appeared in the fossil record about 360 million years ago. And so what seeds are, they are adaptations that allow for dispersal of the embryo on land. And what seeds allow the embryo to do is survive very harsh conditions, and that has to do with some of the structures of the seed. So the seeds are covered in a protective coat called a seed coat, and they also contain a food reserve to help nourish the embryo. Now, seeds have an amazing ability to survive for a very long period. So there's a palm. This is a date palm. So palms are angiosperms, but a few date palm seeds were actually found at an archaeological site. These seeds were a few thousand years old. Okay, so they were found in an old pot at an archaeological site. One scientist decided to see if she could get these to germinate. So she planted them, babied them, and sure enough, they germinated. And so there is a date palm growing in Israel now that grew from 2,000-year-old seed. Okay, so seeds are obviously a adaptation to terrestrial environments because they allow these seeds to stay dormant for a very long time until they reach an area where conditions are ideal for germination and growth. We saw heterospory a little bit when we talked about the basal plants, but what you need to know about seed plants is that all seed plants are going to be heterosporous, okay? So they're going to produce two different types of spores. They'll produce megaspores and microspores. So microspores are going to develop into a drought-resistant pollen grain, which is going to be the male gametophyte. Okay, so all that pollen that gets all over your cars, you might have pollen allergies, that make you sneeze in the spring or in the summer, that pollen is actually the male gametophyte stage of the gymnosperm and angiosperm life cycle. The other type of spore that these plants are going to produce are megaspores, and megaspores are going to develop into an ovule, which will house the female gametophyte. And eventually this ovule will become a seed after fertilization occurs. So one other thing here is that no external water is needed for fertilization with the seed plants. So remember, with some of the basal plants, the sperm had to swim to the egg in a droplet of water. That will not be required for fertilization among seed plants because we have pollen grains that are going to facilitate the transfer of the sperm to the egg. And so this allows the plants to expand into drier environments. They don't need water for fertilization, so it's going to be easier for them to reproduce on dry land. Okay, let's first start by talking about the gymnosperms. So gymnosperms are seed-bearing plants that do not produce fruit or flowers. So gymno means naked, sperm means seed, so it's a naked seed. So these plants will bear seeds on cones typically, and they do not contain fruit and they do not flower. So there are about 1,000 species of gymnosperms or so, and we divide them into 4 different groups. The first that you're probably very familiar with are the conifers. So this is the most plentiful of the gymnosperms, at least at this point in the earth. These are our evergreen trees, so pine trees, hemlock trees, yews, anything that doesn't shed its leaves, that have the thin needle-like leaves, those are going to be our conifers. Another class of gymnosperms are called the cycads. Cycads often resemble palm trees, but they're not at all. They are gymnosperms. They do not grow in our region. They grow in tropical areas. We also have the ginkgo tree. So you probably know at least the ginkgo tree shape of leaf. They have fan-shaped leaves. Ginkgos, well, once there were numerous species of ginkgos, there's only one remaining species of ginkgo today, but it's a tree that's commonly planted, especially in urban environments. And the final type of group of gymnosperms are going to be the cnidophytes. These are a really kind of wonky group of plants. We're going to talk more about them in a little bit. Okay, so let's start with our conifers. So conifers, everyone should be familiar with conifers. They grow throughout our landscape. They contain tough leaves. They're needle-like leaves that help them conserve water, so they can grow in really dry environments. They also have a thick cuticle. Remember, the cuticle is that waxy coating that covers the entire plant body and prevents desiccation. So the conifers have a very, very thick cuticle. They also have what we call recessed stomata. So the stomata are they're not on the surface. They're kind of stuck back in little caves. This also helps prevent water loss from the plant. What we will see is that the sporophyte is going to be dominant in all the seed-bearing plants. Remember, we found that the sporophyte in bryophytes is going to be dependent on the gametophyte, and the gametophyte is the dominant generation. And we see that the sporophyte grows in persistence and dominance as we move through plant evolution. And now with the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, we have a dominant sporophyte. So when you're out looking at trees and flowers in your environment, you're looking at the diploid sporophyte form. Conifers, the pollen grains, so the male gametophytes, are going to be carried to the female gametophytes via wind. Okay, so these are going to be wind pollinated. So pollination is going to be the transfer of the female gametophyte to the female reproductive structures. The seed is going to be this dispersal stage of the life cycle. So once the seed forms, it can then be dispersed through various methods. So the seeds of gymnosperms, like the conifers, are going to be dispersed through wind. The wind can blow the seeds off the cones. They're often dispersed as well by animals that come and eat the seeds and carry them off to other locations. So conifers produce both pollen cones, this is what the pollen cones look like. These are going to contain the male reproductive structures, and this is where the male gametophytes will form. And then also the seed cones, which will contain the female reproductive structures, the female gametophyte. So these are the typical pine cones you think of, the ones that you probably threw at your brother or your sister or your neighbor growing up. The pollen cones are much smaller. They're smaller. They're not as they're kind of flaky. They're not as woody as the seed cones are. However, not all conifers produce a woody cone at all. So these are some examples of other types of female seed cones that are produced. This is the cypress. You can see it's kind of a waxy, scaly cone. Yews, which are actually kind of a juicy, fleshy cone, and arborvitae, which resembles the cypress, kind of a waxy cone. It doesn't have really large scales that you typically associate with like a cone. Another important thing to note about the conifers is that they are going to be the largest, tallest, and oldest organisms on Earth. So the bristlecone pine, these are the trees that live to be the longest. There's one in the Great Basin region, so that's the Great Basin. It makes up part of Utah, Nevada, and California. There's a bristlecone pine there that's over 5,000 years old. So this is the bristlecone pine here. And our largest and tallest organisms on Earth are going to be our giant sequoia redwoods out in California. If you've never seen these, I highly encourage you to get out there at some point to see these trees. There's one tree in particular called the Hyperion tree, which is thought to be the largest and tallest organism in the world. It's 380 feet high. I've shown some people here so you kind of have an idea of scale of how large these trees are. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the life cycle of the conifers. This is the only gymnosperm life cycle you'll have to understand. You do not have to worry about learning the life cycle of cycads or ginkgos or any of the ctenophytes. So as I mentioned before, when you walk outside and you look at pine trees in your environment, what you're going to be looking at is the mature sporophyte. So let's start there. So this is our diploid sporophyte, what we associate with a pine tree. That pine tree is going to produce two kinds of cones, pollen-bearing cones and the ovulate cones or the seed cones, all right? So the pollen-bearing cones are going to contain tissue. We call these microsporangia. If you ever see sporangia or sporangium, that just means the cell that's going to produce the spores. So that tissue or that specific cell will produce a spore via meiosis, right? Because we have a diploid organism here and we're going to be producing a haploid spore. So these spores are produced via meiosis, and what we're going to get is a microspore. These are going to be formed in the pollen-bearing cones. And then this microspore is going to divide via mitosis to form a multicellular haploid pollen grain. All right? So this is the pollen grain. It's going to contain two sperm nuclei and also another cell called a pollen tube cell. We did not see these pollen tube cells in the gametophytes in the previous group of plants we studied, but we will see the male gametophytes will have a pollen tube in both the angiosperms and the gymnosperms. Okay, So we talked about how we make our male gametophyte. Let's go back up and talk about the female gametophyte. So again, we have these seed cones, and on each scale of the seed cone, what we see are megasporangium, right? The megasporangium is going to undergo meiosis. One of these cells here, in this case, it's called a mother cell, but don't worry about that. This is the diploid megasporangium cell that's going to undergo meiosis. And what's going to happen? It's going to produce 4 cells, but only one of them is going to survive. Okay? The one cell that survives is going to be called the megaspore. So here we are, we have tissue, megasporangium, that underwent meiosis to produce haploid spores. So we have our megaspore and our microspore. Okay? The megaspore is going to divide to form the female gametophyte. Again, this is via mitosis. So it's going to be a multicellular female gametophyte. And one of those cells will be the egg. Okay? So we have our male gametophyte, our pollen grain, which is going to have the sperm, and our multicellular haploid female gametophyte here that's going to contain the egg cells. All right? So in the case of this pine tree, we're going to actually have 2 eggs in the female gametophyte that will get fertilized when the male gametophyte is going to land onto the female seed cones, and this pollen grain is going to start growing towards the female gametophyte. And it's this tube structure that's going to facilitate the movement of the sperm to the egg so we get fertilization. All right? So what's going to happen? You're going to have 2 eggs here. This pollen is going to produce the sperm, which is going to fertilize one of these eggs, and it will develop into an embryo within this ovule, which is the structure that houses the female gametophyte, and we're going to have a seed that's going to form within the cone. Once that seed is formed within the cone, it can then be dispersed via wind or animals, and that seed will germinate and become the next generation of the sporophyte. Okay, I just want to mention some of the uses of conifers. So one of the main uses of conifers is for building materials. We get a lot of lumber. Now, the conifers are a soft wood, but they're still really important in construction. A lot of building studs, walls, these are all going to be made out of conifers. They're also used to make roofing material, plywood. A lot of construction materials are made with conifers. Paper is also made using the softwoods of conifers. Conifers are used for landscaping and decorations, especially in the winter. We don't eat too many conifers, but there are a few that are consumed. One are pine nuts. You may be familiar with pine nuts. These are the seeds of different types of pine trees. So these are consumed. They're consumed a lot in Italy and also out in the Southwest. They're also consumed as well. And then these are called juniper berries, and these are the seeds. They're not true berries because berries are fruits and conifers don't make fruits. But these are the seeds of the juniper tree. And the juniper tree these juniper berries are used as kind of an herb or a spice in certain cuisines, especially like Scandinavian cooking. They use some of these. It's also used as an agent to flavor different types of beverages like gin. There are medicines that we derive from conifers. So one example is Taxol. Taxol is an important therapeutic agent that's used to treat breast cancer. And this was originally isolated from this plant here, which is called the Pacific yew. Finally, conifers are also important to isolate different types of resins and oils, so different types of oils like pine oil. Turpentine is also made from a resin of a conifer. Okay, let's move on now to another group of gymnosperms that you are probably less familiar with, and these are the cycads. So while the cycads resemble palm trees, they are not palm trees, okay? Palm trees are angiosperms. They flower and produce fruits. Cycads are going to produce cones. You may have seen these if you visited a tropical area or if you've gone, a lot of conservancies have these growing. So if you've ever been to Phipps Conservancy, you may have seen some of these cycads. They can really vary in size. Some of them are really small. You can have them as houseplants. Others are quite large. They could be maybe 15 feet across or so. So cycads are larger. They have these finely divided leaves that grow in clusters at the top of a stem. And then they have cones on them. Some of these cones can be over 1 meter long. One thing that's unique about cycads is that the plants are going to have a specific sex. So a plant will either produce a pollen cone or will produce a seed cone. And it's believed actually that the cycads are pollinated. The pollen is transferred, so the male gametophyte, the pollen grain, is transferred to the female cones by beetles actually rather than wind. And while they do produce a pollen tube, the sperm of cycads actually is flagellated, so it will swim through the pollen tube to reach the egg. The cycads were very, very plentiful during the Mesozoic, so they were very common when the dinosaurs were around, and cycad seeds were consumed by the dinosaurs as well as a food source. Some people still eat cycad seeds, you know, in areas where cycads are native. Their seeds are collected and consumed as well. Okay, so you're probably at least familiar with ginkgos. So ginkgos, like cycads, are also dioecious, which means they either are going to produce male cones or female cones. So there will be female ginkgo trees and male ginkgo trees. Just like the cycads, they're also going to have flagellated sperm, but they are also going to have a pollen tube that's going to facilitate the transfer of that sperm to the egg. Ginkgos have a very distinct leaf shape. They have these fan-shaped leaves. They first appeared during the Jurassic period, but this is the only surviving species here. This is the Ginkgo biloba. So you can see this is the ovule. This is going to house the seed, and the seed is going to just be naked, you know. So I guess this is kind of like a cone. I don't even know if ginkgos are considered to have cones or just having ovules that are formed directly on the branches. So here's the seed here. Interesting thing about these seeds is these seeds, they're kind of fleshy, and they really, really, really have a foul odor when they ripen in the fall. So typically, even Ginkgo biloba is planted in cities because it's super tolerant to things like pollution. It doesn't need a lot of water, aren't too many insects that bother it. But the one thing they have to do is make sure that they plant only male trees, because the females produce these seeds which fall to the ground and they basically smell like dog poop. They're really, really not pleasant to have around. So this is the ginkgo tree. You may have heard of Ginkgo biloba as an herbal medicine. Some people claim that you can take it to boost memory and concentration. And that's our only surviving species. Here I'm showing a fossil of a different species of Ginkgo biloba that is no longer living, that has gone extinct, and you can see that while it still has a fan-shaped leaf, it has these kind of dissected leaves, so it's made up of little multiple heart-shaped leaves to get this fan-shaped structure. Okay, next up are the neophytes. The neophytes contain 3 really unique groups of plants that don't look at all alike, okay? So the first group are going to be the Needhams. These are tropical vines, and you can see they produce the seeds directly on the plant. It's kind of similar to the ginkgo. These are actually eaten too. They're collected. Most of these Needhams have edible seeds, so people will collect these where they grow native and consume them. This is called the Welwitschia. This is another group. These are found in desert locations. You see a lot of these in South Africa. They have these big, thick leaves, and you can see the pollen cones being born on this Welwitschia. They're also called the resurrection plant because they're super desiccation tolerant. So they basically look like a dead, dried up old plant. But they're just dormant, and if you water them, they very quickly spring back to life and start looking green again. The final group are called the Ephedra family. These make up a bunch of desert shrubs. They grow in the American Southwest. They grow in Mexico. And this is called Ephedra. You can see they have these really unique structure here. This is the microsporangia that's being born directly on the branches. These actually, ephedra, it might sound familiar because they contain ephedrine. That's where ephedrine was first isolated. This is a decongestant. It's a stimulant. Sometimes this plant, the common name for this plant is called Mormon tea because the Mormons would consume this plant out west as a substitute for coffee and tea, which they were not allowed to drink. Ephedra can also be used to make undesirable or illegal substances like crystal meth. Okay, so that's it for the gymnosperms. Let's move on to the angiosperms now. So angiosperms are seed plants that are going to have specialized reproductive structures. Those are going to be flowers, and then specialized dispersal structures called fruits, which are going to form from parts of the flower. This is a very, very large and successful group of plants. There's over 270,000 known species. New species of angiosperms are discovered nearly every day. And so we have a lot of angiosperms. They have done quite well in the world. So angiosperms can range in size from being very, very small. So the smallest angiosperm is actually duckweed. You may have seen this growing in ponds. It produces a tiny flower. Like each duckweed leaf is probably, you know, a few millimeters in diameter, and then this is a close-up of one of these tiny leaves showing the tiny little flower. They can also be quite large, so the eucalyptus trees are going to make up the largest of the angiosperms. This is one called rainbow eucalyptus, which is a really unique kind of eucalyptus. It grows in Southeast Asia, and it produces this bark that's all sorts of colors. So these eucalyptus trees can get 250 feet tall or so. The angiosperms became the dominant group of plants about 100 million years ago, and they've been so successful on land because of these specialized reproductive structures. So they're flowers and then they're dispersal structures of fruits. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of flowers. So the flower is a specialized organ for reproduction, and it's going to be made up of 4 different types of structures. And I'm going to start on the outside and work my way inside. So on the outside of most flowers are structures called sepals. These are usually green, but they could also be different colors. They can also, sometimes they even look exactly like the petals. So yeah, you can usually identify them by being on the outside of the outermost circle of organs on the flower. These are called the sepals. They're going to protect the flower bud before it opens. The colored ones are also going to have a similar function as the petals, which are going to be the next kind of circle of structures. Excuse me. The next circle of structures, and they're often brightly colored. Sometimes they contain nectar glands to attract pollinators. So the function of the petals is to attract a pollinator to the plant. In the next swirl out are going to be the stamens. This is going to consist of a long, thin structure called a filament and an anther. The anther is where the male gametophyte will be produced. And then on the inside of the flower, the innermost structure is going to be the carpel, which is a vase-like structure. It's going to have 3 distinct regions. At the top is the stigma. The stigma is usually flat at the top, and it has a sticky substance that helps the pollen grain stick to the carpel. The style is going to elevate the stigma outside of the flower. And the ovary is the structure that's going to become the fruit. And within that ovary, you will have one or two ovules. You can actually have a whole lot more than 2 ovules in certain plants. These ovules, when fertilized, will become the seeds. So a complete flower is going to have all 4 parts. Otherwise, we're going to call it incomplete. Okay? So while many flowers have most of these structures, some flowers are not going to have any petals. Some flowers may be either a male flower or a female flower and will only contain one type of reproductive structure. All right, so just let's review this by looking at an actual flower. So we're going to start on the outside here. These are going to be the sepals. Again, these are green, they're photosynthetic. They're going to protect the flower as it's developing. And then we have the petals. This is going to be the next swirl in. These are often brightly colored. They might have glands that secrete scents to attract pollinators, or structures called nectaries that are going to produce the sweet nectar that pollinators will feed on. And then in our next circle in here we have the stamens. So the filament is this long thin structure here, and the anther at the top is going to be where all that pollen can be found. Oops. And then finally on the inside of the flower we're going to have the carpel. So we're going to have 3 parts of the carpel: the stigma that's going to contain the sticky surface that's going to give the pollen something to adhere to, the style, and the pollen tube is going to grow down through the style when it germinates on the stigma. And then at the base here we're going to have the ovary. The ovary will develop into the fruit later, and then the ovary will contain at least 1 ovule, and the ovule is going to contain the female gametophyte, which will have an egg, and it's the ovule that will form the seed after fertilization. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the life cycle here. So the male and the female gametophytes are going to develop in the flowers from microspores and megaspores. So just like the gymnosperms, the angiosperms are going to be heterosporous. The male gametophytes are contained within the pollen grains, so they are going to be produced here in the anthers. The female gametophyte is going to develop within the ovules contained within the ovary of the carpel. Okay, so that's where our gametophytic generation is going to exist. Some key aspects of the angiosperm life cycle: just like the gymnosperms, we're going to see a dominant sporophyte. So all the flowering plants in your environment that you see are going to be the sporophyte, the diploid form. Aside from the pollen grain, you're not going to be able to really see the female gametophyte unless you're looking at it under a microscope. So flowering plants are going to produce pollen and seeds. They are also going to produce flowers, which will serve as reproductive organs. And they're also going to undergo something unique. This is called double fertilization. This is only seen in angiosperms. So each pollen grain will actually have 2 sperm nuclei. One will fertilize the egg. The other is going to fertilize another cell in the female gametophyte. This cell is actually going to be have 2 nuclei. It's called a central cell, and it's one cell. It has 2 nuclei, and the other sperm is going to fertilize that cell to produce a triploid cell, which will then develop into the endosperm. Okay, endosperm. This endosperm is going to be the nutritive tissue of the embryo housed within the seed. So this is really important here. Okay, so double fertilization. Angiosperms are also going to have fruits, which typically are formed by mature ovary tissue, but they also can include other parts of the flower. Okay, so let's go through the life cycle of an angiosperm. So here we have a cherry as a representative angiosperm. So let's start with the sporophyte. right? So we're going to start here. A seed is going to germinate and grow into a mature cherry tree here. So this is going to be diploid, right? So this is the young sporophyte. Once it gets to a certain age, it's going to produce flowers that have all these structures on them, and it's going to include stamens, which are going to have produce the pollen grains, and then the ovules, which are going to have tissue that undergoes meiosis to produce a megaspore. Okay, so here we are here. So cells in the ovule undergo meiosis. So these are going to be called megasporangia. Sometimes they're called megaspore mother cells. There's a lot of different names for them. So you just have to know that this is going to be diploid tissue that's going to undergo meiosis to form 4 haploid megaspores, but only one of them is going to survive. The other 3 are going to perish. And then this megaspore is going to undergo mitosis to form a multicellular haploid female gametophyte called the embryo sac. The embryo sac is housed within the ovule of the ovary. Mentioned this already. This megaspore is going to develop into a female gametophyte by mitosis, and one of these cells is going to be the egg. This cell here is the central cell. It's the one that has 2 nuclei and will develop into the endosperm. All right, so let's talk about the male gametophyte now. So if we look in the anthers of the stamens, we will have cells called microsporangia or microspore mother cells that are going to undergo meiosis to form haploid microspores. Okay, so all of these are going to survive though and undergo mitosis to form a multicellular pollen grain. So the cells of the pollen grain are going to include 2 sperm cells and 1 pollen tube cells. So the pollen grain is going to be the male gametophyte, 2 sperm cells and 1 tube cells that will grow into the pollen tube to facilitate the transfer of the sperm to the egg. So pollination. So pollination is different than fertilization. Pollination is the transfer of the male gametophyte to the female reproductive structures of the flower, right? So basically pollination means when the pollen grain lands on the stigma. So once that happens, the pollen tube will start to grow down through the style around the ovary, and there'll be a tiny little hole at the base of the ovary called the micropyle that will allow the pollen tube to enter the female gametophyte. And then it's going to discharge the sperm, and we have double fertilization. So we have 1 sperm that fertilizes the egg, and the second sperm is going to fuse with the polar nuclei here to form the endosperm tissue. The embryo, the zygote here, will then develop into the embryo, and it'll be packaged within the seed, which will develop from the ovule, and contain this endosperm food resource. And there we go. We're back to our seed, which will germinate and grow into the next generation of the sporophyte. Okay, just briefly, there are 2 main groups of angiosperms, the monocots and the eudicots. So the monocots and dicots are the 2 major classes of angiosperms. Monocots make up 1/4 of angiosperm species. They're going to include the lily, which is also the onion and garlic family. So lilies, daffodils, tulips, those are all the lily family. Orchids, palm trees, and grasses. Those are the 4 major groups of monocots. There's other ones, but the ones that you'd be most familiar with. And the eudicots. So the remaining species, 2/3 of these species are eudicots. There's a few other types of dicots that are called the basal dicots, so that's why we don't add up to 100 here, or 1. And eudicots are going to make up 2/3 of all angiosperms. These are going to include like a lot of the other plants that you might eat or grow in your garden. So sunflowers, peas, oak trees, maples, tomatoes, roses. These are all examples of eudicots. This monocot eudicot nomenclature is due to the presence of the seed leaves. So monocots only produce one seed leaf. When they germinate, eudicots will have two. So that's where those names come from. There's a few other differences as well between monocots and dicots. So we have one cotyledon in the seed for monocots, two for dicots. A great way to tell if it's a monocot or dicot is to look at the leaves. So monocots usually have parallel venation. So the veins, the vascular tissue in the leaves are going to be arranged in lines. Dicots are usually going to have branched or net-like veins. Okay. You can also, if you are looking at through a microscope, you can tell if it's a monocot or dicot by the organization of the vascular tissue. You can also look at the roots. So dicots usually have a thick taproot, think like a carrot. Monocots, grasses, if you ever pulled up a clump of corn or grass in your yard, it has a very fibrous root system with not a distinct taproot. So here's a big distinct taproot. You can see the fibrous root system here. Another good way to tell the difference between monocots and dicots is to look at the flowers. So monocots usually have flower parts in multiples of 3. So this is a lily. Lilies are a little bit tricky because the sepals look like the petals. So you have 3 sepals, 3 petals, and if you counted the stamens, you'd see that they probably have 3, 6, or 9. And then they usually have a single fused carpel. Now dicots will have flower parts in multiples of 4 or 5. This is a columbine flower, and you can see that there's 5 sepals. So this is a situation where the sepals look like petals, just like up here. 5 petals, and then the stamens will be 5 or 10 or whatnot, and then usually the carpel is fused, but sometimes you'll actually have multiple carpels. Okay, one thing that's unique to angiosperms is that animals in some angiosperms are very important to reproduction. So different types of arthropods, insects, and vertebrates are important in pollination, so the transfer of the pollen grains to the stigma, and also the dispersal of the seeds and fruits. So they're important for sexual reproduction. They're also important for dispersal of the embryos. So these animals, they don't realize what they're doing, but they carry pollen from flower to flower because the plants give them a reward for doing so. This comes in the form of nectar, which is high in sugar and a really good source of calories for the animals, and also pollen. So a lot of insects, like bees especially, will eat pollen, which has a lot of protein in it. Animals will be attracted to different types of colors and scents of the flowers, so that is a way that the plant can lure them to the flowers. And what we see is that something called coevolution has occurred between angiosperms and their pollinators. So coevolution is when 2 different organisms act as agents of natural selection on one another. So they evolve in response to one another. And this is what we see with many different flowers that are pollinated by insects. So what we see is that flowers have many different types of adaptations to attract animal pollinators, and likewise the animal pollinators have adaptations to help them get to the resources being offered by the plants. So the shape, the structure, the color, odor, the type of nectar produced by a plant it can attract a very specific type of pollinator. And we call these characteristics associated with a specific mode of pollination syndromes. So if we look here at this flower, this I believe is a yucca flower or an aloe flower. You can see that it's orangish in color. You can also see that it has this long tube structure that this little tiny hummingbirds beak will fit perfectly into, right? So the hummingbird has this long, narrow beak that has evolved to get nectar from these flowers. And these flowers have these long floral tubes that are specific for pollinators that can have access it. So a bee wouldn't be able to access the nectar in here, only a hummingbird or a butterfly. Bees, on the other hand, really like pollens, and they also see in the ultraviolet, and they're attracted to blue and yellow colors. So you'll often see bees on blue and yellow flowers. These flowers will produce lots of nectar. They'll have a sweet odor, and lots of pollen as well, because the bees use pollen as a protein source. So you're going to look more in lab and examine some of these different pollination syndromes that are associated, which are, again, different types of floral characteristics that are associated with a type of pollinator or mode of pollination. Okay, we didn't talk much about fruits yet. So their fruits form from ovaries usually, though they can contain other parts of the flower as well. And fruits are really important because fruits are going to protect the seeds, right? So it's one other layer of protection to help the embryo on dry land. They're also very useful for dispersing the seeds to new locations, which is going to be important because since plants can't move, they need to get away from their parent plant so you don't have all this competition between siblings and family members among plants. So seeds can be carried by wind, water, animals to new locations. And fruits have different types of adaptations to help disperse the seeds away from the parent. So this is a maple seed here. You may have played with these as a kid, or called them helicopters. These are maple seed, the fruit of the maple seeds. And so the seed's in here, and this is the fruit structure. So they have these wings that help them catch the wind and get wind dispersed to a new location. Another mode of dispersal is facilitated by animals or potentially your genes if you walk through the woods. And so these here are burdock fruits. So the burdock root, which grows all along the woods around us, they stick to your pants, they'll stick to your dog if you take them for a walk in the woods. And then, of course, your dog will carry them out to a new location where they may fall off and germinate. Also, another fruit adaptation is the fruit might taste sweet or juicy, right? So animals might consume the seed and then move off to another location where they will defecate, and the seed will be located in a nice pile of fertilizer in a different location. And then finally, I just want to mention that we are more reliant on the angiosperms than any other plant to our survival. Angiosperms are key sources of food and beverages. So think of all the monocots, or the cereal grains, right? So the grasses, so corn, rice, wheat. These are very important sources of food for us and for livestock. Also for beverages, so beer, wine, coffee, tea, these all come from angiosperms. Fuel, so I think I mentioned ethanol before. Wood products, so we have the hardwoods like maple and oak that are used for furniture and for building other types of products like pianos and doors, and also for medicine. So there's artemisinin, which is from wormwood, that's an angiosperm, and there's countless other medications that are derived from the angiosperms. And it's very important that we protect plant diversity. So some of the most diverse areas of the world are the rainforests that are currently subjected to very, very high rates of habitat loss in order to produce more agricultural fields for growing things like soybeans. So we need to make sure we protect these pockets of plant diversity so that we can continue to identify plants that have desirable properties, especially in terms of finding medicinal plants. We need to isolate these plants before they go extinct. At its current rate, tropical forests, about 50% of the Earth's species will be extinct within the next 100 to 200 years. So protecting and documenting and understanding this diversity is very, very important. Okay, so that's it for today. Make sure you review the lectures notes and read your textbook and take your quiz before lab.